Tonight at 10, on the eve of the referendum, the last-minute campaigning to try to convince millions of voters. For David Cameron of Remain and Boris Johnson of Leave, it's been a day of reinforcing their basic campaign messages. The Prime Minister has been telling voters again that staying in the EU is the only option that makes sense.
Go out and vote Remain for a bigger, better Britain inside a reformed European Union. Stronger, safer, better off. A day to go. Let's do it.
After 9 weeks of relentless campaigning, Boris Johnson was telling voters that this was their opportunity to take back control.
This is a great moment for our country and a time to be optimistic about what Britain can achieve and to believe in ourselves.
The forthcoming success of the UK will be down to us coming out of Europe.
No, but why are you leaping into the unknown? That's what I don't understand.
We're not leaping into the unknown.
And even in these closing hours of the campaign, the debate is still intense as millions prepare to visit the polling stations. We're in the BBC's referendum studio with all the news of the final stages just 9 hours before those polling stations open. Also tonight, we report from Libya, where government-backed forces have made significant gains against the fighters of so-called Islamic State.
The buildings that they're targeting right now contain snipers. They've been mapping them for the past 2 weeks, thanks to a drone and British Special Forces.
One of many vigils held for Jo Cox, the Labour MP killed last week. Today would have been her 42nd birthday. And in Euro 2016, what is now in store for the home nations in the next stages?
And here in the south, the final push. In and out campaigners canvass our region ahead of Thursday's EU vote. And the distress of the A-level students whose exam didn't cover any of the areas they expected.
A very good evening from the BBC's referendum studio. This is where we'll be covering the results tomorrow night from across the United Kingdom as tens of millions of voters decide Britain's future in the European Union. The stakes, of course, are extremely high, and that's been underlined by the intensity of the campaigning on this final day before polling. David Cameron declared once again that Britain would be stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. Boris Johnson repeated his campaign theme that this was an opportunity for Britain to take back control of its affairs. Our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, spent time with both campaigns in the closing hours, and her report does contain some flashing images.
5 a.m. in London. They'd almost pucker up to anything to get out the vote. By 7:30, the main Tory face of leaving the EU was geeing up supporters in Essex.
Fantastic, you are the salt of the earth.
An hour later, the Prime Minister on the factory floor again, this time with Harriet Harman. Your decision could change his career.
Thank you very much.
Ramming home his message with a little help from his friends.
If they vote to leave on the basis of half-truths and untruths and misunderstandings, then pretty soon the grave diggers of our prosperity will have some very serious questions to answer.
Is he wondering if he'll also be a former Prime Minister by the weekend? To Ashby de la Zouch in Leicestershire, the closing hours of a campaign that's been vibrant and noisy.
How are you? Can we count on you tomorrow?
And if the polls tell us anything, a result that could be very tight.
Thank you for coming out this morning, though.
But what do you think is going to happen? What's your sense?
It's impossible to know. I hope everybody who wants to take back control of our democracy will come out and vote tomorrow. And I just say to people who are making their minds up that I think the safest thing to do is to vote leave, because if we don't, we're just locked in this thing. It'll go on and on with no reform at all.
A senior politician once said to me, the more hands they shake, the more votes they get. It's not quite as simple as that, but he's giving it a damn good try.
Go and take control. Thank you.
Why would you leap into the unknown?
But there's been anger and anxiety on both sides too.
Can you shut up?
No, I can't shut up.
Nobody wants to listen to you.
They do. No, you
Nobody
don't want
wants
to
to
listen to me,
Nobody
mate,
wants to
'cause you're
listen to you.
wrong.
You got nothing
That's
to
why
say.
you don't want to listen.
verbal diarrhea.
Yes, you've got nothing
You
to
don't
say.
want to listen because I'm 17 and you think I'm illiterate.
But what the UK decides about the EU could affect our other union.
I'm off to Benidorm with these guys.
The SNP wants you to remain.
Thank you very much.
Nigel Farage.
But this is the moment for the man whose years of campaigning for out pushed to this decision a day away.
Vote with your heart, vote with your soul, vote with pride in this country and its people. And together we can make tomorrow our Independence Day.
Whether battle bus, plane, helicopter, or simply walking in wellies, whatever it takes today.
The leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn.
Then a show of strength for Labour. The leader's a reluctant Remain, but will his voters really listen?
The vote is tomorrow. Do what's best for our people. Vote for jobs. Vote for rights at work. Vote for our NHS. Vote to remain in the European Union.
But on the south coast at lunchtime, the most bitter fight has been among Tory friends and rivals.
More and more people I've found have been warm and responsive and recognise that voting Leave is the optimistic thing to do.
It's 3 o'clock and the school buses are all lined up and the Prime Minister is on his home turf for a visit in Oxfordshire.
Just in case you hadn't noticed, he wants this choice to be about the next generation. Might he be wondering if only they all had a vote?
A couple of weeks ago you told me you weren't worried about the result, but it seems so uncertain. You must be now.
Well, obviously, I think for the sake of the country, it's really important we vote to stay in, because that is how we're going to have a stronger economy, that's how we're going to be safer as a country, that's how we're going to be stronger as a country. So in this last day, we need to make all those arguments and we need to encourage people to get out there and vote to Remain.
What's your hunch?
Either way, your choice will not be the end of this extraordinary story. The referendum has already changed our politics. This is only the end of part one. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Oxfordshire.
Well, there are more than 46 million people registered to vote in tomorrow's referendum, all of them being asked to decide whether Britain should leave the European Union 43 years after it joined the European Economic Community, as it was then back in 1973. One of the main claims of the Remain campaign has been that further reform of the EU might be possible. But the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said today that there can be no renegotiation of the terms of the UK's membership. Well, as the campaign leaders were crisscrossing the country, so was our deputy political editor, John Pienaar, to see what voters made of today's final push.
Something big was going on outside, something blonde. Fun to watch these campaign visits, but now most people's minds are made up and there's no budging them. What are you going to do?
Leave.
Why are you going to say vote Leave?
Why? Because I'm proud of my country. This country built the world, really.
Yeah.
Railways, you name it. And they're insulting my country by saying we can't manage, we can't do this, we can't do that. No.
Cameron's put me off it for a start.
Yeah.
How did he do that?
Well, the lies.
Lies. He comes out with everything he wants to tell you.
The Boris Johnson circus moves on, past others just as concerned, but maybe more cautious than cross. You made up your mind you're going to vote?
I'm voting to stay in.
You sound very certain. Why are you so sure?
I'm not definitely sure, to be perfectly honest, but I'm more concerned about my job and all the things like that. So, well, my son actually is doing economics at school in sixth form, and he's been giving me a bit of an ear-roll blasting. So
what's he been telling you to do?
He's been telling me to stay in.
But worries about migrants keeping wages down keep coming up.
They're happy to work at £4 or £5 an hour less than I'm willing to work at, which is what, you know,
what do you do?
Is the norm. Well, what can you do?
What do you do? What do you do for
well, I do a couple of things. I'm in finance, but I also got a trucking industry.
In Banbury, the news in the town is David Cameron's campaigning down the road. You're in charge here. What's your name?
My name's Charlie.
And how are you going to vote?
I'm going to vote in.
Tell me why.
I like the free movement of people. I like the fact that my brother lives out in Spain, has made a life for himself there, has his own company and is happy. I don't know how it'll affect him, and if I want up sticks tomorrow and go to Italy, I can.
Okay, guys, sorry to gatecrash your party. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Look, you're not going to do a poll here straight away. In or out Europe. Who's in?
Roxanne.
Roxanne, why are you in?
I think our economy is a lot stronger in the EU. I also think a lot of people are voting out because they haven't decided, because they don't know enough information. But I think, why would you take that risk? If you're unsure, vote to stay in.
The country is good the way it is, and I don't know much about politics anyway, so I'd rather not take the risk.
You're an outer. Why are you an outer?
Various reasons, but I think the one that's most important to me is my vote is for a government, and I give them a mandate to govern, and I don't ever give Europe a mandate to govern us, and it's as simple as that.
So minds have been made up, even if tempers have been tested on the way. John Pienaar, BBC News, Banbury.
Well, the past 9 weeks of campaigning have been dominated, for the most part, in any case, by two issues, the economy and immigration. So let's consider how these arguments have developed. We're going to be talking in a moment to my colleague here, Mark Easton, our home editor. But first, let's talk to our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, who's in the City of London tonight. Kamal, your sense of how the economic argument has progressed during this campaign?
Well, certainly, Hugh, there has been a blizzard of statistics when it comes to this most important issue at the heart of the referendum, the economy. What would the consequences be if Britain remained in or left the European Union? I think amid all the noise, all the claims and counterclaims, there are two important points that can be defined. Firstly, most serious economic organisations do say that in the short term at least there would be a negative economic impact if Britain were to leave the European Union. They suggest that trade with the EU would become more difficult, and the EU is our most important export market. They say that uncertainty could damage growth. And then the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, he said that Britain could face recession, which would be a threat to our jobs, to house prices and to our incomes. Now, over the longer term, forecasts are far more uncertain. Some economists that back Brexit say that, yes, there could be some short-term uncertainty, but over the longer term, the UK economy would flourish, freed, as they see it, from the shackles of the EU. They say red tape would be reduced. They argue that we would be able to sign easier free trade deals with important trading partners like the US and China, without the need for agreement with 27 other EU members. I've just come back from Windsor, where Lord King, the former governor of the Bank of England, he gave a bit of a health warning about all these economic arguments. He said some of them were exaggerated, whether it's the plague of locusts on one side or the sunny uplands on the other. I think some economists would agree with that. The former Clinton aide gave a famous answer when he was asked what wins elections. It's the economy, stupid, he said. Polls do suggest that voters are swayed by the economic arguments. Whether they're swayed towards Remain or towards Leave, we'll only know once the polls have closed.
Indeed, Kamal. Thanks very much. Kamal Ahmed there, our economics editor in the City of London. Mark Easton with me, our home editor. We heard a lot about freedom of movement initially, and then, of course, more specifically, the argument about immigration. What did you make of it?
Do you know, I think for most people in Britain, the most direct experience of the European Union in the last few years has probably been the sight of a Polish deli or supermarket opening in their high street. The last 12 years has seen the most extraordinary phenomenon. 1.7 million EU citizens coming to live in Britain, often in areas which have been unused to these kind of sort of foreign arrivals. That's why immigration is clearly one of the key issues for so many. People feel uneasy about the change, but because of those EU rules on free movement, the politicians will tell them we can actually do very little or nothing about it. So, if we leave the EU, Britain could also leave the single market. That would mean we're no longer bound by those rules on free movement, and we could introduce what the Leave campaign calls an Australian-style points system, pretty much as we already have for non-EU migrants. But if people think that this is a vote to stop foreigners coming in, I really don't think it's that simple. Remember, both Boris Johnson and Michael Gove on the Leave side have said they are pro-migration, and they won't say that immigration would go down if we leave. On the Remain side, they also talk about controlling immigration. So the argument on this issue, I think, isn't really about numbers, it's about control and whether shaping the kind of immigration that Britain wants can be achieved better in or out.
OK, Mark, thank you. Thanks very much again. Mark Easton there, our home editor, with his thoughts on the immigration debate. So with millions of votes being counted at hundreds of regional centres across the UK, how are those results then likely to come in? And when, crucially, might we have a clear idea of the final result? Jeremy Vine is here with a look at what we can expect. Jeremy?
Yes, we have here a ballot paper that's been enlarged for you, just so you can see the question you might well be answering tomorrow. Very simple, blindingly simple. Remain a member or leave the European Union. 2 boxes, and you put your cross in one or the other of them. Now, the counting will happen in council areas across the UK, with the one exception of Northern Ireland, where it happens in Westminster constituencies. But in a way, that doesn't matter, because the votes are put basically into 2 big boxes and weighed against each other. Every vote counts the same wherever you are in the country. Let's look at how we're analysing the votes as they come in. Welcome to our virtual Downing Street. We're using the colour blue for Leave and yellow for Remain, and gradually we'll build them up from the far end of Downing Street. So just for illustration, I'll make this a 50-50 scepnario here. By midnight, we're expecting Newcastle and Sunderland to be in. By about 1 in the morning, you're expecting a result from highly Eurosceptical Basildon, and also the smallest counting area, the Isles of Scilly, 1,700 voters there. And then by 2 in the morning, we're expecting lots of results to come in from Scotland, Clackmannanshire, for example, and East Lothian. By 3, some bigger numbers. We'll have Thanet, we'll also have Bristol, and fascinatingly Durham, which, as well as being quite a large area, not the city, the council area, remember, for Durham, it's also a 50-50 part of this election. So fascinating to see which way Durham goes. 4 in the morning, the big cities start to come in, including Birmingham with 700,000 eligible voters, and Middlesbrough and Leeds and Cardiff. Is it still going to be 50-50 at that stage? If so, we have to wait till 5 in the morning and get more big numbers from Manchester, from Liverpool and from Bradford. My goodness, if it is that close at 5 in the morning, we might have to wait till 6, when we'll hear from Cornwall and Shropshire. Either way, by 7 in the morning, one of these bars, blue for Leave, yellow for Remain, should have passed the winning line that leads back to number 10, Downing Street. We have an absolutely fascinating night in prospect for you here in what is normally the election studio, but tomorrow will be our referendum results studio. Hugh.
Looking forward to it, Jeremy. Thanks very much. Jeremy Vine there for us. So, on the eve of referendum day, let's get some thoughts then from Brussels and from Westminster. We can talk to our Europe editor, Katya Adler, in Brussels, and our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. Katya, first of all, then, in Brussels, let's talk about the mood in the rest of the European Union. What's being said?
Well, Hugh, tonight across Europe, leaders are on the edge of their seat, worried about the UK referendum. None of them want Britain to leave. They see it as one of the big powers alongside France and Germany. And also here across the Channel, the UK is seen very much as one of those fundamental powers. There is a worry that if the UK leaves, this could lead to contagion elsewhere. And that is a huge concern for the leaders. And that's why they say if the UK chooses to leave, they would get tough over a trade deal. The UK is an attractive trade partner, they admit it, but they say they don't want the process to be painless. They want to put others off leaving. If you look at Germany and France, for example, they have key elections next year and they don't want to encourage Eurosceptic parties waiting in the wings. And if you look at some of those reasons why the Leave campaign is popular in the UK, those demands to get powers back from Brussels, objections to borders without controls, to migration policies, allegations of bloated Brussels bureaucracy. These are complaints that echo across the EU, and that is why recently you've heard the words EU and reform coming from the nervous mouths of some of those you might least expect. Angela Merkel just today, and even the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said it's true. The EU meddles too much.
Katya, thanks very much. Let's go straight to Westminster and Laura. Laura, here we are. We're on the eve of referendum day. We've talked so much in the last few weeks of this very hard-hitting campaign. What are your thoughts tonight?
Well, Hugh, there are so many strands to all of this, and through the campaign, you know, the themes have pretty much been the same of the economy and immigration. The grumpiness has pretty much been the same, and very bad-tempered and bruising at some times. But, you know, there has been one big change. If we think back to the start of all this, which seems like a very long time ago now, the narrative was very much David versus Goliath. The Outers felt that in a short campaign it was going to be very difficult for them to build up to a position where they looked credibly, potentially, like winners in all of this. That narrative has completely changed. And in a part of the world, in Westminster, where people like to feel that they're in the know, they like to feel that they've got the inside track, almost every conversation I've been having in the last couple of days ends up with one conclusion. It does feel like it is apparently just too close to call. Very informed people, people very close to the heart of things, are saying privately again and again, we just don't know. And rather than still trying to persuade people, politicians are packing up the platforms and turning their attention to getting out the vote. Because in a race that appears to be so tight, the proportion of voters on either side who feel enthused or worried enough to turn up to vote, it's turnout, that crucial number, that momentum that could make the difference.
Laura, thanks. We'll talk a little more at the end of the programme. Katja, thanks to you in Brussels as well. Katja Adler and Laura Kuenssberg. Yes, we will have more on the referendum a little later on. And I must remind you, there's more referendum news and information and analysis, blogs from Laura and Katja and all of our other colleagues on our website, bbc.co.uk/news. Let's turn to some of the day's other news now then. In Libya, government-backed forces have made significant gains against the fighters of so-called Islamic State. Local militia are being supported in a major offensive by British special forces. And the fighting has been going on since last month. Yesterday was the toughest day so far, with nearly 50 fighters killed and over 140 injured on the government side. Our Middle East correspondent Quentin Somerville and cameraman Fred Scott have just returned from the front line near the main IS stronghold of Sirte, and some viewers may find parts of their report upsetting.
On another continent, the war against the so-called Islamic State is changing gear. Many of these Libyan fighters are fasting for Ramadan. After 2 weeks of hard fighting, they're weary, but they're readying for the next offensive and bringing more firepower to the front. They're close enough to IS to shout insults down the street. IS has held this city for more than a year. On Muammar Gaddafi's conference centre, their flag looms large. They're battling on many fronts. We were the first journalists to make it to the Islamic State's port. Over the horizon lies Europe. It's the job of the men of Brigade 166 to stop IS escaping by sea. The only problem we're facing is suicide car bombs. We're dealing with them by taking out their tyres and firing heavy weapons at them and closing roads. There would be a battle in the morning. These men have already lost 9 comrades. They got what sleep they could. 500 metres away, we watched the north of Sirte. There was no rest. They say this is a dirty war. Neither side is taking much in the way of prisoners. In the morning, the next push came from the south. These men have taken a lot of ground in a very short space of time, but it's been stalemate for a while. IS are over that hill, they're cut off and they're pinned down. This is the next offensive to face them. It's more difficult terrain. The deeper they move into the city, the greater the risk. They've got little in the way of air support. This battle is being fought the old-fashioned way. The buildings that they're targeting right now contain snipers. They've been mapping them for the past 2 weeks, thanks to a drone and British Special Forces. These fighters are young, but some are veterans from the war against Gaddafi. One joked, "Take my picture for me, I'm going to die today." And this was their bloodiest day yet. Almost 150 were wounded. 50 men, mostly from nearby Misrata, died in the battle. Some were taken straight from the ambulance to body bags. Mahmoud said he had to fight. IS beheaded our children, they crucified them and threw them off buildings. They've terrorised people and abused their faith to justify their crimes. Their country and their faith is at stake. For Libya, only more sacrifice lies ahead. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Sirte.
President Putin of Russia has blamed the West for failing to prevent the Second World War. In a speech to the Russian parliament on the 75th anniversary of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, President Putin said that some Western leaders had underestimated the threat from Nazi Germany. He then added that present-day leaders were in danger of making the same mistake over international terrorism. The Labour MP Jo Cox has been remembered at vigils around the world today on what would have been her 42nd birthday. She died last week after being shot and stabbed in her West Yorkshire constituency. Thousands of people, including her 2 young children, attended an event in London's Trafalgar Square, as our chief correspondent Gavin Hewitt reports.
Jo Cox's husband Brendan and their 2 children, Coolin and Layla, travelled down the Thames today to join a celebration of her life. Today would have been her 42nd birthday. It's a week since she was killed while holding her MP's surgery in Yorkshire.
Jo's life was centred around...
Several thousand people had gathered in Trafalgar Square. Many of them were holding pictures of Jo Cox. Some of them had come from Yorkshire, some signed pledges supporting her causes. Her husband came on stage and spoke of how the family had coped in the past few days.
We try to remember not how cruelly she has been taken from us, but how unbelievably lucky we were to have her in our lives for so long.
He then spoke about his wife's killing.
What a beautiful irony it is that an act designed to advance hatred has instead generated such an outpouring of love.
Among those who spoke was the Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai.
And Jo's life is a proof that a message of peace is more powerful than any weapon of war. Once again, the extremists have failed.
Jo Cox's death has been a key moment in the referendum campaign, sparking reflection on the tone of intense political debate, on how claims and counterclaims are framed. But today was a day for tributes to a campaigning MP from friends, family and former colleagues. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News.
The Glastonbury Festival has announced that it's now open for business following a day of gridlocked roads and lots of disruption. Some people trying to get to the event in Somerset were stuck in their cars for, well, as long as 12 hours. Organisers said rain and muddy conditions had caused delays and had urged people not to set off at one point. The long queues also affected local residents, with some pupils arriving late for their school exams. Let's talk about football then. And after today's action, the home nations now know who they'll be playing in the first knockout round of Euro 2016. Our correspondent Howell Griffith is with the Welsh team in the port of Dinar in Brittany. Howell, why don't you tell us about these fixtures?
Well, Hugh, it's a system so complicated it's closer to the Eurovision Song Contest than European football. Most of the fans and players have spent all day going through the permutations, but finally the results are in. We know who the 3 home nations will play, and, well, 2 of them will play each other. On Saturday in Paris, it's Wales versus Northern Ireland. 2 teams who know each other very well. They played in a friendly only in March. The result of that one, a draw. Of course, that can't finish that way on Saturday. One of them must win, and one of them will definitely go through to the quarter-finals. What about the 3rd home nation? Well, England next Monday. They play the tournament's smallest nation, Iceland, who, with a late goal, managed to secure their place in the tournament. For most of the day, it seemed as if England would play against Portugal, but I'm sure Roy Hodgson's men were cheering in that Icelandic goal that game on Monday in Nice. But probably the result of the night actually belongs to the Republic of Ireland, who tonight beat Italy, keeping their place in the tournament. Their game is against the hosts, France, on Sunday.
OK, Howell, looking forward to it all. Thanks very much. Howell Griffith there for us in Dinard. Now, Rory McIlroy has pulled out of competing at this summer's Olympic Games in Rio because of concerns about the Zika virus. The four-time major winner, who is due to represent Ireland, said that although the risk of infection is considered low, it wasn't a risk that he was prepared to take. So, polling stations, they'll be open in just over 8 hours' time in every part of the United Kingdom as voters make the biggest decision on our place in Europe since the 1970s. The campaigning on this last day has been relentless, as we've been reporting. So let's take stock now with my colleagues, and they are Chris Buckler in Northern Ireland, very near the border there with the Republic of Ireland, Sean Lloyd for us in Cardiff, and first, our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, in Glasgow. Sarah, what's your assessment there of the sense of the campaign on this final day in Scotland?
Well, the really intriguing thing about the campaign in Scotland has been that all the major party leaders agree. They all want to remain. And there really haven't been any high-profile politicians campaigning for a vote to leave. But if leaving is what the voters of the UK do decide, then that could have really profound implications for Scotland. That's because the leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, has said repeatedly that if Scotland is, in her words, dragged out of the EU against its will, that could trigger a second referendum on Scottish independence. Now, that's not what she says she wants. She's campaigning for a vote to remain, not least because she doesn't really want to have a referendum in those circumstances quite so quickly. And anyway, voters in Scotland are starting to look pretty weary, because remember, this is the fourth major electoral event we've had in this country in just a little over 18 months.
In Wales, leading politicians from both sides of the divide have been making a final push for the Welsh vote tonight in a televised debate on BBC Wales. And over the course of the past week in campaigning, there's been a palpable sense of urgency here. On both sides, politicians careering up and down the country trying to get their key messages across. Remain reminding people of what they call is a lucrative relationship between Wales and Europe. £4 billion of structural aid over the past 16 years to some of the poorest parts of the country, including the South Wales valleys. There's been talk that a withdrawal could damage the economy. But their opponents say that EU-funded projects would still be financed if there was a vote to leave. And in those traditional Labour heartlands, there are serious concerns over immigration, talk about a disillusionment with politics. A vote to leave from there in this tightly run contest here in Wales could be crucial to the results here.
Narrow Water here in County Down is a well-named place because the short stretch of water just behind me marks the point where Northern Ireland meets the Republic of Ireland. And it will come as no surprise that on this shared island, much of the referendum debate has focused on the question of what would happen to that border if there was to be a vote to leave. As it is, it's open and there's much trade that goes across it every day. Now, Remain campaigners have argued that customs checkpoints or perhaps even extra security might have to be introduced if the Irish border was to become the point where the UK met the EU. However, Leave campaigners have pointed out that the common travel area has existed for decades, allowing free movement across Britain and Ireland, and they say that doesn't need to change. Among some of the other issues that have been discussed time and time again here are questions about identity and sovereignty. Of course, those are no strangers here in Northern Ireland to political debate, but often people discuss whether they feel Irish or British or even Northern Irish. This referendum has been somewhat different. It's been about whether people feel European, and indeed how European they want to be.
OK, Chris, thanks very much. Chris Buckler there for us, and Sean Lloyd in Cardiff and Sarah Smith in Glasgow. Thank you all very much. Some views there for you from Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. And in England, where, as we were mentioning, immigration and the economy have been featuring prominently, for some voters, the central question has been one of sovereignty and Britain's place in the world. Our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, has been talking to some voters in Leicestershire.
Welcome to Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire, home to Stilton cheese, the town's famous pork pies, and one of England's oldest markets. Home, too, to voters for whom this referendum is not just about trade or borders, but about something much more fundamental.
We was a great nation once, let's bring it back.
We should govern ourselves, shouldn't we? We don't really need to be told what to do.
Out. Why?
Why? We'll be in control of ourselves.
For many, tomorrow's referendum boils down to one question. Should our laws be made in Brussels or Westminster? But in a town whose pork pie is protected from cheap imitation by EU regulations, some fear more sovereignty could mean less influence.
I want to be with our neighbours. I want to be making decisions with them for the good of the continent and wider people.
If the EU decides it for me, that's just as good for me as Westminster. We probably get a fairer debate within Europe.
When Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, it pooled some of its sovereignty in return for a say over its biggest market. But that was a step too far for Richard Stubbs, a farmer from Derby, who thinks Britain should leave and look for new markets, just as he's done today.
I've taken a step forward to come to the markets myself, and my opinion is it's the same as our country. We don't need all these other places coming and helping themselves. You've got to have the confidence, you know, to go and stand in there, find the dealers, find the customers and sell to them. It's no use sitting at home.
Do you think Britain should be like that too?
Absolutely right.
But Matthew O'Callaghan, chairman of the local pork pie association, fears losing a seat at the EU's top table.
We give up some of our sovereignty to the United Nations as being members of the United Nations. We give up some of our sovereignty locally to the local council, to Westminster. You know, you have to accept that if you want to get the benefits of being part of this larger club. In Melton, we earn £70 million from food tourism related to pork pies and Stilton cheese. That could actually possibly disappear almost overnight.
This campaign's been dominated by claim and counterclaim about what impact leaving the EU might have on immigration and the economy. But much of that is speculation. What we know for certain is that who decides the laws that affect markets like these and others is on the ballot paper. Should we keep our seat in Brussels or return powers to Westminster? By demanding more control over immigration, this is a debate where Leave have made much of the running. Remain say it's an illusion of sovereignty that would leave Britain with less control. James Landale, BBC News, Melton Mowbray.
James Landale there with some voices from Leicestershire. Time for a final word with our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. And just to underline, Laura, that what happens tomorrow, the decision taken, will resonate for many, many years to come.
It certainly will, Hugh, and, you know, referenda, by their very nature, force the nation into two boxes. I don't think that's been a comfortable process for the country, and I think it certainly won't be comfortable in the aftermath, whatever the result is. What happens to the Tory party, to David Cameron, after all these bruising rows? Has the Labour Party just really discovered how disconnected they are from some of the voters that they used to rely on? More positively, perhaps, has a new generation of younger voters been mobilised for the first time? But, you know, more than any of that, it is so rare as individuals, as a country, that we have a moment like this, a chance where we go into the polling booth, draw back the curtain, pick up the stubby pencil and put a cross in a box to make a decision that has profound implications, not just for us here in the UK, but potentially could change the political map of a whole continent. It really is time for deep breaths all round, Hugh, because the decision is as big as that.
Laura, thanks very much again. At Westminster, Laura Kuenssberg there. And that's all from us in the BBC Referendum studio. The results programme will start here tomorrow night at 5 to 10, with all the news as it unfolds right through the night until the verdict of the voters is clear. We think sometime early on Friday morning. In a moment, it's time for the news where you are, but we'll leave you with some of the most memorable words and images, some flashing images on the way, by the way, of this referendum campaign. Have a good night.
I will go to Parliament and propose that the British people decide our future in Europe through an in-out referendum on Thursday, the 23rd of June.
we have a chance actually to do something. I have a chance actually to do something. I would like to see a new relationship based more on trade, on cooperation, but as I say, with much less of this supranational element.
We are better off, we are stronger, we are safer inside a reformed European Union.
Hello. Well, we're trying.
I'm a Brexit.
You're a Brexiter. Very good indeed. Hello there. How are we? All right.
Some of the natural allies, I'm sorry, but I'll be voting with you on the 23rd of June. Thank you very much.
Why are you leaping into the unknown? That's what I don't understand.
We're not leaping into the unknown.
We don't know what it's like outside of your work.
We've been there before with the ERM.
Yeah, but the economy has changed since we last were out of Europe. Has it or has it not?
No.